The background to the Civil War, Part 2. So if slavery existed in the West, free labor would not migrate there. If slavery went west, workers would stay north. And then what would happen? Eventually there would be an oversupply of labor in the north. Wages would be driven down to the poverty level. It's simple supply and demand. The land of opportunity, the American dream, would disappear. Or so Northerners believed. Instead of prospering, Northern whites would face poverty. And so the spread of slavery is the issue, but not for the sake of black people. Slavery must be kept out of the territories to preserve opportunity for whites. That's why the North was so obsessed with keeping slavery out of the Western territories. Yes, it's true, many Northerners were genuinely anti-slavery. Abraham Lincoln was one of them. But most Northerners were more concerned with opportunity for white people than for black people. And even the Lincoln family, when they migrated out of Kentucky, they did it for their own personal economic advancement. And so even though the North was racist and anti-black, the North wanted slavery out of the Western territories to preserve the American dream for Northern white people. Now, what about the South? The South was every bit as determined that slavery must expand into the Western territories. And the South had its own reasons. First reason, as the Southern population expanded, the South needed new territory to expand onto in order to continue its way of life. If the West was closed to slavery, the next generation of Southerners would not be able to get land and become slaveholders or even planters. The definition of a planter, by the way, is a slaveholder who has 20 or more slaves. The 19th century South had its own peculiar version of the American dream. Today's non-slaveholder is tomorrow's slaveholder. Without new Western land to expand onto, that Southern version of the American dream could not become a reality. Second reason that white Southerners wanted slavery to go west, they made a pretty straightforward constitutional argument. Southerners said, look, slaves are our property, and we have the right to go with our property wherever we want, including the Western territories. And you can't take that right away from us. It's a constitutional right. The Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says you cannot take a person's property away without due process of law. Slaves are our property. We have the right to go west with our slaves. You cannot take that away from us. It is the duty, in fact, of the federal government to protect that constitutional right. The third argument white Southerners made, that slavery must go west, was the most important of all. White Southerners knew that slavery had to spread to the Western territories, or they would face a racial cataclysm. Just imagine if slaves were confined to the states where they currently existed. Well, over time, the numbers of slaves are going to grow and multiply beyond what was needed to run the plantations in those states. Soon planters would have too many black mouths to feed, and then planters might start freeing their slaves out of economic necessity. And freeing slaves is the worst nightmare of Southern whites. This was already happening in Virginia and Maryland, and we talked about it when we looked at slavery. Remember, Virginia and Maryland were moving out of tobacco and into wheat. That means they had a surplus of slaves. And what were they doing with those surplus slaves? They were selling them down the river down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi River, to work on plantations in new slave territory opening up to the south and west. Well, imagine if Virginia and Maryland could not get rid of their surplus slaves. Well, eventually, they would have too many slaves, and they would start freeing their slaves, and that's the worst nightmare of Southern whites. The bottom line, for slavery to survive, it needed to expand geographically. If you contained slavery geographically, if you bottled it up, if you did not allow it to expand west, the South's worst nightmare would result: emancipation. This became, by the 1850s, a obsession, a hysterical fear among Southerners that Lincoln's election would bring emancipation, race war, race mixing to the South. Remember, when Thomas Jefferson talked about race war, he was pretty confident the whites would win. But by the 1850s, that confidence has disappeared and has given way to hysterical white fears of black emancipation, and then the South becomes something like the Haitian Revolution. White people get raped and murdered by free slaves. And so the white South was obsessed and feared Lincoln's election, that Lincoln's election would keep slavery out of the territories and therefore pose an existential threat to the white South. You know, today, from time to time, Americans have hysterical fears that the government will take your guns away. White Southerners had hysterical fears that the federal government will take their slaves away. Now, there's not much that North and South agreed upon in the 19th century. They couldn't agree on anything. But one thing they did agree on was this: if you bottle up slavery, if you contain it geographically, if you do not allow it to expand west, eventually it will die. The institution will die. It's just a matter of time. And no one was real sure about how long it might take, 50 years or 100 years, but everyone agreed if you bottle up slavery geographically and don't allow it to expand, it will die. So the North wanted the territories free. The South wanted them slave. Each side was looking at the exact same piece of real estate. The two labor systems were mutually exclusive. If slave labor went in, free labor could not, and vice versa. As the 1850s progressed, each section, North and South, began to believe that the other side was conspiring against it. Each section, North and South, began to exaggerate, magnify, and distort what the other section was all about, and each section began to see a conspiracy in the behavior of the other section. Northerners began to see what they called a slave power conspiracy. What Northerners meant when they talked about a slave power conspiracy is they were convinced that white Southerners wanted not only to take their slaves west into the territories, but that was just the first step, and that Southern whites really wanted to take their slaves north as well and nationalize slavery throughout the United States. That is what Northerners meant when they talked about a slave power conspiracy, a Southern attempt to nationalize slavery throughout the U.S. But Northerners were not the only ones who saw a conspiracy brewing. Southerners saw it too, a very different type of conspiracy. Southerners saw what they called an abolition conspiracy. Southerners were convinced that the North wanted not only to keep slavery out of the Western territories, but that was just the first step. That next, Northerners wanted to end slavery in the South where it existed. In other words, white Southerners become convinced that all Northerners are abolitionists. The presidential election of 1860 took place in this context, in this atmosphere of panic and hysterical fear, where each section saw a conspiracy in the behavior of the other section. Let's take a good hard look at the presidential election of 1860. It is one of our more fascinating presidential elections. In 1860, there were 4 presidential candidates. The Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln. The platform, of course, no slavery in the territories. Again, Lincoln and the Republicans were not abolitionists. Now, as I mentioned, the Democratic Party had, during the 1850s, increasingly become a pro-South, pro-slavery party. But a wing or faction of the Democrats still existed in the North. And so what really happens to the Democrats in 1860 is they split into Northern and Southern factions. The Northern Democrats ran Stephen A. Douglas for president. The platform? Popular sovereignty. The Southern Democrats ran a man named John C. Breckinridge for president. On a pro-slavery platform, slavery must expand into the Western territories. 2 fun facts about John C. Breckinridge. He was the sitting vice president of the United States at the time in 1860. He was President Buchanan's vice president. And the second fun fact about Breckinridge, he's the youngest vice president we've ever had, 35 years of age. There was a 4th party in 1860 called the Constitutional Union Party, and it nominated a man named John Bell for president. And this Constitutional Union Party looked for some type of compromise on the slavery issue to save the Union. Why don't we just draw a line to the Pacific Ocean and allow slavery south of it and no slavery north of it? And so the Constitutional Union Party was looking for some sort of compromise on the slavery issue to prevent a civil war.